Hi, I'm Maddie, and welcome back to the Anti-Alienation Project. Here in my project, I talk about all things related to a certain type of child psychological abuse called parental alienation. Parental alienation is when one parent manipulates a child against their other loving parent without true justification. This is a really damaging and long-lasting form of abuse, and I've been speaking out about this since I figured out I had gone through it about 2 years ago now. Today's video is going to be unlike any other that I've shared. If anyone knows me personally, you know that I love writing and reading, always have since I was a toddler. My whole time during college, there was one short story that stood out to me and made an impact on my life more than any others. And it's odd because I was definitely alienated from my dad when I read this short story and studied it in class, and it really spoke to me, but I wasn't sure why because I was alienated. So I thought I would share this, and it's not specifically about parental alienation, but it is about having two parents who have a dysfunctional relationship or probably never should have been married in the first place. If short stories and fiction reading and writing isn't your jam, feel free to just skip this video. It's a short story that was written a while ago. It's called In Dreams Begin Responsibilities by Delmore Schwartz. It's really well known and highly acclaimed. I will say one thing, it's a little slow to begin. It takes a little while to really get into the story, but I think that if you stick it through and listen to the end, that you will have some really good takeaways. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let's get started. In Dreams Begin Responsibilities by Delmore Schwartz. I think it is the year 1909. I feel as if I were in a motion picture theater, the long arm of light crossing the darkness and spinning, my eyes fixed on the screen. This is a silent picture, as if an old biograph one, in which the actors are dressed in ridiculously old-fashioned clothes. And one flash succeeds another with sudden jumps. The actors, too, seem to jump about and walk too fast. The shots themselves are full of dots and rays, as if it were raining when the picture was photographed. The light is bad. It is Sunday afternoon, June 12th, 1909, and my father is walking down the quiet streets of Brooklyn on his way to visit my mother. His clothes are newly pressed, and his tie is too tight in his high collar. He jingles the coins in his pockets, thinking of all the witty things he will say. I feel as if I had now relaxed entirely in the soft darkness of the theater. The organist peals out the obvious and approximate emotions on which the audience rocks unknowingly. I am anonymous, and I have forgotten myself. It is always so when one goes to the movies. It is, as they say, a drug. My father walks from street to street of trees, lawns, and houses, once in a while coming to an avenue on which a streetcar skates and gnaws, slowly progressing. My father has chosen to take this long walk because he likes to walk and think. He thinks about himself in the future, and so arrives at the place he is to visit in a state of mild exaltation. He pays no attention to the houses he is passing, in which the Sunday dinner is being eaten, nor to the many trees which patrol each street, now coming to their full leafage at the time when they will room the whole street in cool shadow. An occasional carriage passes, the horse's hooves falling like stones in the quiet afternoon, and once in a while an automobile looking like an enormous upholstered sofa puffs and passes. My father thinks of my mother, of how nice it will be to introduce her to his family. But he is not yet sure that he wants to marry her, and once in a while he becomes panicky about the bond already established. He reassures himself by thinking of the big men he admires who are already married, William Randolph Hearst and William Howard Taft, who has just become President of the United States. My father arrives at my mother's house. He has come too early, and so is suddenly embarrassed. My aunt, my mother's sister, answers the loud bell with her napkin in her hand, for the family is still at dinner. As my father enters, my grandfather rises from the table and shakes hands with him. My mother has run upstairs to tidy herself. My grandmother asks my father if he has had dinner and tells him that Rose will be downstairs soon. My grandfather opens the conversation by remarking on the mild June weather. My father sits uncomfortably near the table, holding his hat in his hand. My grandmother tells my aunt to take my father's hat. My uncle, 12 years old, runs into the house, his hair tousled. He shouts a greeting to my father, who has often given him a nickel, and then runs upstairs. It is evident that the respect in which my father is held in this household is tempered by a good deal of mirth. He is impressive, yet he is very awkward. Finally, my mother comes downstairs, all dressed up, and my father, being engaged in conversation with my grandfather, becomes uneasy, not knowing whether to greet my mother or continue the conversation. He gets up from the chair clumsily and says, "Hello," gruffly. My grandfather watches, examining their congruence, such as it is, with a critical eye, and, meanwhile, rubbing his bearded cheek roughly, as he always does when he reflects. He is worried. He is afraid that my father will not make a good husband for his oldest daughter. At this point, something happens to the film. Just as my father is saying something funny to my mother, I am awakened to myself and my unhappiness just as my interest was rising. The audience begins to clap impatiently, and then the trouble is cared for, but the film has begun returning to a portion just shown, and once more I see my grandfather rubbing his bearded cheek and pondering my father's character. It is difficult to get back into the picture once more and forget myself, but as my mother giggles at my father's words, the darkness drowns me. My mother and father walk down the same quiet streets once more. My mother is holding my father's arm, telling him of the novel which she has been reading. My father utters judgments of the characters as the plot is made clear to him. This is a habit which he very much enjoys, for he feels the utmost superiority and confidence when he approves and condemns the behavior of other people. At times, he feels moved to utter a brief "ugh" whenever the story becomes what he would call sugary. The tribute is paid to his manliness. My mother feels satisfied by the interest with which she has awakened. She is showing my father how intelligent she is and how interesting. My father tells my mother how much money he has made in the past week, exaggerating an amount which need not have been exaggerated. But my father has always felt the actuality somehow fall short. Suddenly, I begin to weep. The determined old lady who sits next to me in the theater is annoyed and looks at me with an angry face, and being intimidated, I stop. I drag out my handkerchief and dry my face, licking the drop which has fallen near my lips. Meanwhile, I have missed something, for here are my father and mother alighting at the last stop, Coney Island. They walk towards the boardwalk, and my father commands my mother to inhale the pungent air from the sea. They both breathe in deeply, both of them laughing as they do so. They have in common a great interest in health, although my father is strong and husky, my mother frail. Their minds are full of theories of what is good to eat and what is not good to eat, and sometimes they engage in heated discussions on the subject, the whole matter ending in my father's announcement, made with scornful bluster, that you have to die sooner or later anyway. On the boardwalk's flagpole, the American flag is pulsing in an intermittent wind from the sea. My father and mother go to the rail of the boardwalk and look down on the beach where a good many bathers are casually walking about. My mother remains at the rail and stares at the ocean. The ocean seems merry to her. It pointedly sparkles, and again the pony waves are released. She notices the children digging in the wet sand and the bathing costumes of the girls who are her own age. My father returns with the peanuts. Overhead, the sun's lighting strikes and strikes, but neither of them are aware of it at all. The boardwalk is full of people dressed in their Sunday clothes and idly strolling. The tide does not reach as far as the boardwalk, and the strollers would no longer feel danger if it did. My parents gaze absent-mindedly at the ocean, scarcely interested in its harshness. The sun overhead does not disturb them, but I stare at the terrible sun, which breaks up sight in the fatal, merciless, passionate ocean. I forget my parents. I stare fascinated and finally shocked by the indifference of my father and mother. I burst out weeping once more. The old lady next to me pats me on the shoulder and says, "There, all of this is only a movie, young man, only a movie." But I look up once more at all the terrifying sun and the terrifying ocean, and being unable to control my tears, I get up and go to the men's room, stumbling over the feet of other people seated in my row. When I return, feeling as if I had awakened in the morning, sick for a lack of sleep, several hours have apparently passed, and my parents are riding on the merry-go-round. My father is on a black horse, my mother on a white one, and they seem to be making an eternal circuit for the single purpose of snatching the nickel rings which are attached to the arm of one of the posts. A hand organ is playing. It is one with the ceaseless circling of the merry-go-round. For a moment, it seems as if they will never get off the merry-go-round because it will never stop. I feel like one who looks down on the avenue from the 50th story of a building, but at length they do get off. Even the music of the hand organ has ceased for a moment. My father has acquired 10 rings, my mother only 2, although it was my mother who really wanted them. They walk along the boardwalk as the afternoon descends by imperceptible degrees into the incredible violet of dusk. Everything fades into a relaxed glow, even the ceaseless murmuring from the beach and the revolutions of the merry-go-round. They look for a place to have dinner. They do go to the best place, asking for a table near the window so that they can look out on the boardwalk and the mobile ocean. My father feels omnipotent as he places a quarter in the waitress's hand and he asks for a table. The place is crowded, and here to there is music, this time from a string trio. My father orders dinner with a fine confidence. As the dinner is eaten, my father tells of his plans for the future, and my mother shows with an expressive face how interested she is and how impressed. My father becomes exultant. He is lifted up by the waltz that is being played, and his own future begins to intoxicate him. My father tells my mother that he is going to expand his business, for there is a great deal of money to be made. He wants to settle down. After all, he is 29, and he has lived by himself since he was 13. He is making more and more money, and he is envious of his married friends when he visits them in the cozy security of their homes, surrounded, it seems, by the calm domestic pleasures and by delightful children. And then, as the waltz reaches the moment when all the dancers swing madly, then with awful daring, he asks my mother to marry him, although awkwardly enough and puzzled even in his excitement at how he has arrived at the proposal, and she, to make the whole business worse, begins to cry. And my father looks nervously about, not knowing at all what to do now, and my mother says, "It's all I've wanted from the moment I saw you," sobbing, and he finds all of this very difficult, scarcely to his taste, scarcely as he thought it would be, and on his long walks over Brooklyn Bridge in the reverie of a fine cigar, and it was then that I stood up in the theater and shouted, "Don't do it! It's not too late to change your minds, both of you. Nothing good will come of it, only remorse, hatred, scandal, and 2 children whose characters are monstrous." The whole audience turned to look at me, annoyed. The usher came hurrying down the aisle, flashing his searchlight, and the old lady next to me tugged me down into my seat, saying, "Be quiet, you'll be put out, and you paid 35 cents to come in." And so I shut my eyes, because I could not bear to see what was happening. I sat there quietly. But after a while, I began to take brief glimpses, and at length I watched again with thirsty interest, like a child who wants to maintain his sulk, although offered the bribe of candy. My parents are not having their picture taken in a photographer's booth along the boardwalk. The place is shadowed in the mauve light, which is apparently necessary. The camera is set to the side on its tripod, and it looks like a Martian man. The photographer is instructing my parents in how to pose. My father has his arm over my mother's shoulder, and both of them smile emphatically. The photographer brings my mother a bouquet of flowers to hold in her hand, but she holds it at the wrong angle. Then the photographer covers himself with a black cloth, which drapes the camera, and all that one sees of him is the protruding arm in his hand, which clutches the rubber ball as he will squeeze it when the picture is finally taken. But he is not satisfied with their appearance. He feels with certainty that there is something wrong in their pose. Again and again he issues from his hidden place with new directions. Each suggestion merely makes the matters worse. My father is becoming impatient. They try a seated pose. The photographer explains that he has pride. He is not interested in all of this for the money. He wants to make beautiful pictures. My father says, "Hurry up, will you? We haven't got all night." But the photographer only scurries about apologetically and issues new directions. The photographer charms me. I approve of him with all my heart, for I know just how he feels. And he criticizes each revised pose according to some unknown ideal of rightness, and I become quite hopeful. But then my father says angrily, "Come on, you've had enough time. We're not going to wait any longer." And the photographer, sighing unhappily, goes back under his black covering, holds out his hand, and says, "1, 2, 3, now!" And the picture is taken, with my father's smile turned into a grimace and my mother's bright and false. It takes a few minutes for the picture to be developed, and as my parents sit in the curious light, they become quite depressed. They have passed a fortune teller's booth, and my mother wishes to go in, but my father does not. They began to argue about it. My mother becomes quite stubborn, my father once more impatient, and they began to quarrel, and what my father would like to do is walk off and leave my mother there. But he knows that would never do. My mother refuses to budge. She is near to tears, but she feels an uncontrollable desire to hear what the palm reader will say. My father consents angrily, and they both go into a booth, which is, in a way, like the photographer's, since it is draped in black cloth and its light is shadowed. The place is too warm, and my father keeps saying this is all nonsense, pointing to the crystal ball on the table. The fortune teller, a fat, short woman, garbed in what is supposed to be oriental robes, comes into the room from the back and greets them. But suddenly my father feels that the whole thing is intolerable. He tugs at my mother's arm, but my mother refuses to budge. And then, in terrible anger, my father lets go of my mother's arm and strides out, leaving my mother stunned. She moves to go after my father, but the fortune teller holds her arm tightly and begs her not to do so. And I, in my seat, am shocked more than can ever be said, for I feel as if I were walking a tightrope 100 feet over a circus audience, and suddenly the rope is showing signs of breaking. And I get up from my seat and I began to shout once more the first words I can think of to communicate my terrible fear. And once more, the usher comes hurrying down the aisle, flashing his searchlight. And the old lady pleads with me, and the shocked audience has turned to stare at me. And I keep shouting, "What are they doing? Don't they know what they are doing? Why doesn't my mother go after my father? If she does not do that, what will she do? Doesn't my father know what he's doing?" But the usher has seized my arm and is dragging me away. And as he does, he says, "What are you doing? Don't you know that you can't do whatever you want to do? Why should a young man like you, with your whole life before you, get hysterical like this? Why don't you think of what you're doing? You can't act like this, even if other people aren't around. You will be sorry if you do not do what you should do. You can't carry on like this. It's not right. And you will find out soon enough, everything you do matters too much." And he said that, dragging me through the lobby of the theater in the cold light, and I woke up in the bleak winter of my 21st birthday. The windowsill shining with its lip of snow, and the morning already begun.